Okay, it looks like we're live, but I'm not seeing. Just gonna wait for it to come up on the Facebook. Here we go. Okay. Okay, we figured it out. Everything always changes every single time we do a live stream. So thank you everyone for your patience. We'll let a few more people get to joining, but we are live. We did it. So, okay. Hello everyone and welcome to the live stream. This is Meryl with Akron Soul Train, and tonight I am joined by our artist in residence, Lori Kella, for a virtual walkthrough of her exhibit, Shifting Grounds, that is currently up in our Burton D. Morgan Foundation exhibition space in downtown Akron. Lori is showing alongside fellow resident artist, Danielle Dixon, whose exhibit A is currently also in our capsule gallery. And both shows will be ending Saturday, August 27th. So if you stop by and see the shows in person, this is your last week to do that. Our gallery hours are 11 to 4 from Wednesday to Saturday. So you guys have another week to see the work in person. And we hope that you guys are able to do that. Akron Soul Train is an artist residency program connecting and empowering the community and artists by granting fellowships that provide resources for all creative disciplines to foster a more vibrant Akron. We'd like to thank our sponsors for their continued support: the GAR Foundation, the Akron Community Foundation, the Ohio Arts Council, the Leaner Family Foundation, the Brennan Family Foundation, the Knight Foundation, the Char and Chuck Fowler Family Foundation, and the Corbin Foundation. Anyone viewing, please feel free to ask questions, comment below. We will get to them probably towards the end of the program because I'll be out walking around with my phone. And also please comment on any of our videos posted here on Facebook or on our YouTube page, how you like this type of virtual programming. Okay, so Lori, I'm gonna get kind of switched onto my phone. And while I do that, if you could tell us a bit more about yourself and some of the concepts behind your work.
Sure. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Lori Kella, and I'm an artist working predominantly in photography. Though as we go through the exhibition, you'll see how a lot of other media, whether that's sculpture or drawing, also are incorporated into my work. Just to give you a little bit of just my educational background, my undergraduate degree is from the Cleveland Institute of Art, and my graduate degree, my MFA, is from Cornell University. And I'm also an educator, and I have been teaching photography for a while now. So I'm currently teaching at Laurel School in Shaker Heights.
Okay, I thought we could start with this piece because I feel like this might be one of the first pieces that you made in this body of work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really great starting point to really explain the project. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with my work, I'm often building tabletop dioramas or things in my studio to photograph. And for a while, I've really concentrated on landscape. And I'd say maybe since 2018, I focused on Lake Erie and its shoreline. So I live up in Cleveland. I live along the lake. And this particular photograph, which is called Eroding Shoreline, the Calm Before the Storm. So this is actually a view of the shoreline seen from the lake. I often would go out and kayak. And this is a number of the streets sort of next to mine in my neighborhood. And what you sort of see when you're looking at the shoreline are a number of different sort of built sort of docks and platforms and ways for people to access the water or view the lake. But you'll also see erosion controls that have put in place, this sort of mishmash of break walls and stones and things that have built up. And then particularly in summer, you start to see all of this sort of foliage along the hillside. And what this piece does is really, it's a recreation of it. It's certainly this may be more poetic and simplified view of the landscape. And this was really my starting point for the exhibition. Just to give you a little bit of detail on the model itself, it's actually quite large. It's about 8 feet long, built into my studio, maybe just a couple feet high. And this was the first photograph. It took actually a few months to build the model, to create this one. And then all of the other work, or most of the other work, really comes out of rephotographing this model in different ways. So I don't know if you want to maybe, flip around to the opposite wall, or you can show this piece here. So this is more of a detail of that same model. So I was trying to create an overview and then show some more detail. So you can see in this particular photograph, there's these sort of crumbling stairs that lead down to the beach at the end of our street, and then all of the sort of overgrowth and this sort of collapsing hillside. Because what I've seen happen in the past couple of years is that the hillside is really starting to deteriorate from the storms and the lack of protection for the landscape.
Yeah, and I really like how finding that kind of detail. You can tell that everything kind of stems from that one photograph, but the concepts are being pushed in different ways, and this is kind of the first iteration of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And there's I know you showed some details. So, there's not only am I building the model, so sort of sculpting it, but there's drawing and painting on there as well. And really everything is kind of created to serve the photograph.
Okay, so then I'll circle around to these ones because there's a completely different feel, but you're using the same model in this series, correct?
Correct. So this is the same landscape, and there's sort of 5 different shots that travel from left to right along the landscape. And
start in the left.
What I was interested in is just seeing different ways that I could create images from that same model. And so these are much more of a silhouette. They're sort of, I'm placing pieces of vellum and scrim kind of behind some of the landscape, and using strong lighting so that, again, to me, it's very cinematic. So there's these different shadows that are cast onto the different pieces of vellum and transparent papers. And to me, it just created a different feel of the landscape. Yet, if you look at them and you go back and forth, you can see different sort of markers that are present in both of them.
For me, this is kind of like the eerie nighttime fog that will come in on some lakes, and it kind of creates that strange, strong lighting, but where everything's in that silhouette. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of us too that live along the lake, different times of year, spring and fall, where that sort of fog rolls in, and you can't really see the horizon, can be a really beautiful time to be in that space.
So interesting. Okay, so I'm thinking I'm going to flip back around to these large pieces. And this is where you started kind of getting a little bit more almost abstract.
Yeah. So what happens I was trying in many ways to photograph the same model. And I felt like what was happening with the model that I wasn't quite getting, that I was interested in, was the way that this hillside is really starting to kind of collapse, and, sort of rocks tumble down, roots become exposed. And so it really led me to a totally different way of working. So I started, I looked at this model, and I just ended up feeling that what I needed to do was just start to sort of tear it apart. And then I would take different pieces that I had sculpted, and then I would put them onto a large light box or light table, and create these compositions. So in many ways, it's still the same hillside that I'm looking at. So this is one portion of it where there are some trees that are really sort of leaning over the cliff. And so looking at the physical hillside and thinking about how can I create this approximation. So I would use, again, the sculpted paper and put that onto the light table. I would use some of the architectural elements that were created for the physical diorama, and just really have fun sort of playing with recreating that space in a very different way. And for me, if we think about it, it brings in some of the qualities of the silhouettes that we just looked at by using the light table. And I think it really came out of that process. So I was putting scrim and different lighting behind the model because I loved the idea of getting the silhouette. And I think I have done other things on a light box. So it really just led me to that leap to sort of decide, okay, I've got to actually put the whole model on the light box to create the feel that I would like.
Yeah, I love this one because it feels almost more fantasy, like an impossible situation type happening, but something that could also happening where you're in the sense of movement and that falling over.
Absolutely. And because, I mean, that's probably one of the last ones in the exhibition. And they really did start to become a little more fantastic in some ways. And part of it was just asking myself questions as I would go through the process of how do I create that movement? How do I create the force of water without actually having the water present? And yeah, for this one, it does become in some ways the most abstracted. And I keep flipping back between looking at it as this sort of the sliding forms coming off of the hillside, like there's an actual sort of viewing balcony at the end of our street. And it's sort of this idea of everything sort of sliding down into the water. But I also look at it the opposite way too, is thinking of it almost like a cyclone or things sort of coming up from the water as well. And I like that sort of duality or that flip.
Yeah, and these ones and the ones that I'll go to next, they almost don't have backgrounds. So you're isolating certain parts of the landscape. And this one feels so precarious because there's no background cliff that, it's coming down. It's just kind of sitting atop something that doesn't look very stable.
Yeah. And the beauty of making up these, is that, right, I don't have to adhere to, I mean, I physically do have to adhere to the laws of gravity when I'm making them, but I think because they're being made actually on the ground and then they're flipped up. So that sense of top and bottom really disappears. And it gives me this incredible freedom to really play with things that might not be standing up or that might be teetering on edges.
Okay, so now we'll move to this series of 5 panels and I'll get some closer looks, but this is kind of another set where you're experimenting more with those collages, the sense of movement. It's really interesting. You're kind of playing with the composition as well.
Yeah, so
like
this
floating
is directly pulled from that first model, and it is literally taking it apart to make each of those 5 panels. So in some ways, they do pair up with the 5, the scale doesn't quite pair up, but they do pair up with the 5 silhouette panels. And so I made them sequentially, but again, thinking about creating that whole sequence of the hillside when all of the 5 images were finished. So I started with the first one, which was sort of the edge of the model, and just started pulling it apart, started adding in new things to make this composition. I like how they're very map-like. And I also think it's kind of interesting using that white space that in some ways, some of it's just things that aren't represented, and some of that white space is actually the water. And to me, they become more isolated and floating because of that white background. And to me, they kind of flip between being an aerial perspective to a more straightforward perspective. And I love that idea of how we could imagine the landscape both as a sort of map and as frontal view at the same time.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I was seeing them as kind of almost floating in space and forgetting about the water. But then, yeah, they're almost like these weird celestial objects as well.
Yeah, and I think what's great about them is, right, they're so transformative, and there's ways that every time I look at them, you start to see new things. A little bit about the process, just because some people ask. So it's really a mixture in there. So there's sort of a handmade paper, sort of sculpted land forms and land masses, and some of those have drawing and painting on them. And then there's also these bits and pieces of architectural models, whether it's the stairways or the balconies that I had created. And then there's a lot of actual physical objects in there too. So there are tree roots and small bits of foliage that are taken from the shoreline itself. There's real rocks from the beach, but then there's also handmade ones, or sort of quote fake rocks. So I love that sort of play between what things are made out of paper, what things are drawn, and what things are the real object. And that duality, I think, is really intriguing for the viewer to kind of look at it both as a photograph and as a drawing and as a collage at the same time.
And we'll see even more. You work a lot in kind of panels or series. Like this one really adds up to almost a whole image where they all combine. How do you feel about working in like these panels to make that larger kind of landscape?
I mean, yeah, I love working in a series for a couple of reasons. I think, even if I think way back to graduate school, I did a lot of kind of multiple panel pieces. And for me, I think it helps with this idea of time. So you can look at it as a whole, as something that you might see as one image, but you could also go through them sort of left to right and see that maybe time sort of shifts between one panel and the next. Also, just in terms of the practicality of it, I really knew that I wanted to make this piece large, and it gets kind of cost prohibitive and also a little more challenging just to make it as a large piece. That might be, I'm trying to think how many feet long it would be.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I don't remember, but it's sort of daunting. But if you start to think about, okay, well, I can really tackle this and make this really large piece through the panels. And
then, yeah, here at Akron Soul Train, you installed it going around this corner, which I think kind of emphasizes that progression where you almost have to walk through it to see everything instead of being able to see it all together on that one flat wall.
Yeah, I loved working with it on the corner. So this piece, originally I had shown it at Photocentric Gallery, and yes, it took up a long wall in that space. And I had come to the gallery, prior to my exhibition. And I don't know, for some reason, when I saw that corner space, it just clicked for me that that's where I would put that. And I love the play that you can kind of be at this angle that we're looking at it right now and kind of see it as a whole, but you can also, sort of just view 3 of them or just view 2 of them. And it gives you this sort of different opportunity to see it individually or as a whole landscape.
Yeah, it looks so nice on this corner. You just view it around. Okay, we're gonna move to this wall next.
So these are 3 panels, again, that are connect. And what connects these are the actual river or the creek. So this is based off of Euclid Creek, which is a small tributary that leads into Lake Erie, is also really close to my home. And so a lot of the work previous to this was looking at the shoreline, and not specifically the erosion, but looking at some of the restoration of the shoreline. And Euclid Creek, there was a project where they, planted native plants and really tried to sort of restore this area that's in the middle of the city. And we go there for walks, or we'll kayak through there. And there's such an abundance of wildlife. So these are photographs taken. So this was a great blue heron that we observed in a similar setting, sort of on a branch. It sort of hangs out there waiting, using that as an opportunity to fish from. And then the next panel has a beaver. So there's several beaver that swim in and out of the creek. And if you go in the evening in particular, you can usually see them. And then the last panel doesn't have any specific wildlife, it's just plants, and then this sort of overpass or bridge that's part of it. So really looking at these as, in some ways, it's a simulation of our stroll along the creek that we often will do, and sort of documenting some of the flora and fauna that we would see.
Yeah, I like the idea of this being connected by that river. And there's not like, besides the bridge, there's really no man-made elements. So it's very much almost like, yeah, going on a nature walk.
Yeah, and that's so much what its inspiration was. And it's interesting because I did start making these actual as more, dioramas and models and photographing them in a more traditional way. But I think because I had done so much of the work on the light table, I really thought it'd be interesting to see how a more sort of quote typical landscape would translate. And I love that play between things that are really kind of believable as this very sort of traditional landscape, but there's different things that are more flattened, and I can really play with space.
Yeah, the way to kind of do the water, you do it in so many different ways, and water appears in so many different ways that it works out, but that it is kind of an abstracted, because it's water would be, it's very hard to duplicate.
Yeah, it is. And it's kind of interesting because I'm often really trying to play with the landscapes and thinking about how far I can push them or abstract them where they're still red as the space that they're referencing, but I can really play with perspective. I can play with flattening things. So for me, that's really the challenge in my studio, and what I have fun with is, again, and water is really challenging, and I had to think long and hard about how I wanted to tackle this with the project, because it's one thing to photograph it, which is amazing, and I do all the time, but it's really hard to think about it in terms of a diorama or a modeling of it. So my solution in these that we're looking at was actually using some photographs that I took of the lake and then turning them into transparencies and putting them on the light table, and then overlaying with other branches, drawing, rocks, torn paper, those sorts of things to sort of, again, hint at that landscape, hint at the action of the lake, but play with, I suppose, what's flat, what's two-dimensional, what's three-dimensional.
Yeah, this set, there's a lot more, I guess, like hard lines, like straight horizontal and straight vertical lines. So it feels very much more collaged and kind of more abstracted or minimalist in a sense, because of those lines and juxtaposing them like against these kind of more natural zigzagged lines.
Yeah, this was the first one in that series of 3. And again, it was based off that same shoreline and that hillside edge. And this was inspired during the winter time. And there's a lot of ice that comes up as the waves sort of hit that architecture. And it was really fun to play with, how do you create this sense of perspective in this flat space? And I don't know, I was really, there were a number of iterations before I came to this one, but I was really pleased with it. And one thing I'll also note, because some people ask, lots of times when I was showing it, people thought that it was a digital collage, that it was something created in Photoshop. And it is a straight photograph. It's the actual paper drawing and objects are collage, but the photograph itself is a quote straight photograph. But I think it looks in some ways like something you might digitally construct, which is also part of the sort of fun and the play within the work itself.
Yeah, I think having that light table and being able to kind of have such a clean white background. This one, I love the layering down here and how it just like, it's how water kind of layers on top of things.
Yeah, and for me, I think it's a lot of potential. This series and work was probably, created over the past year, but I think to me, there's a lot of interesting techniques that I've explored. And I think I'm excited to start to look at, how I can use some of these techniques, how I can continue to sort of push the boundaries of landscape photography moving forward. And I will say a note too, the residency, Akron Soul Train, gave you a month-long residency. I had already started this work, but I was able to kind of push things and explore things in different directions. I think during the residency is when I made the 3 pieces that followed the creek and sort of took it in a little bit different direction. And then I also worked on making the mobile of mayflies as well during my residency time.
We're going to come to in a minute. And just kind of one more question about, I don't know if you ever get asked this, but like, what do you think is the benefit for you to making these models or these photo collages or whatever you really want to call it, as opposed to actually photographing like what's there in the landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, because I do actually, I do take photographs with my camera of the landscape always as a source material. And for me, the challenge is, I think by creating things in my studio or rearranging them in my studio, I'm really able to tackle a couple of things, both what is that experience in the landscape that I might not be able to get just with a straight photograph. So I think, when I'm thinking about these ideas of the hillside that is actually sort of falling into the lake, when you're just looking at it, I mean, you can see the erosion, you can see this idea of what was there, or the exposed roots, or the things that are uncovered. But I think you really don't get the sense, the immensity of it, and that sense of time. And because I can kind of play with things and abstract things, I can really either create that sense of something falling or toppling, or I can create even more of a sense of mystery with the silhouettes. Or even in the landscape that we had looked at before that were kind of collaging bits of the lake, to me, that's just really playing with perspective and both our perceptions of landscape. So it also allows me to sort of ask the audience questions and get them to think a little bit more about what we see in a photograph, how that photograph may or may not be truthful, and hopefully start to inspire maybe more questions in the viewership than maybe a straight photograph would.
Okay, and then we'll come to the mobile, and I'll try to get some good detail shots of it. But we have this mobile of little mayflies. Oh, here we go. I can get this guy good.
Yeah, so this was fun. I don't know exactly how. In the series, I'd say prior to this that I worked on, maybe from 2017 until maybe 2021, I created this series that was called Ghost Species, that were looking at flora and fauna that was maybe essential to the lake ecosystem. And I would make them out of paper, and then I would photograph them just as individual objects on a light table and do a sort of cataloging of these different species. And to me, the mayfly, it is, or also the midges or any of the tiny insects that kind of hatch in the spring, there's this critical part of the food chain, and some people like them, some people are annoyed when they come out all at once, but they're actually a sign of a healthy lake ecosystem. And I really wanted to, I felt in some ways some of the work with the erosion was maybe focusing on some of the negative aspects that I'm seeing in the environment. And I really thought that the mayfly was something that was this positive attribute. And I guess in seeing them, in the early part of the summer, they often cluster in this big kind of, bait ball in the sky. And so that's what I thought would be really fun to play with, recreating the Akron Soul Train galleries.
And it's just another really interesting way of using photography or digital images to make like a sculptural or installation piece in a way that like wouldn't normally happen.
Yeah, there's this interesting, the work that I do, even though, again, it's really grounded in photography. Yeah, there's often always sort of sculptural elements. And in many ways, I'm just photographing it. But this one sort of flips it and allows you to really see the sculptural objects that I'm often creating in my studio to make the photographs.
Yeah. Oh, my phone camera is not able to get all of the beautiful intricacies of this piece. So anyone watching, if you're able to make it down, definitely have to do that. Okay, well, I'm going to make my way back to my computer. So anyone viewing, if you have any questions or comments, now would be the time to write those in. Another little viewpoint as I walk back to my computer. I can get those comments. You can have a few kind of closing questions. Have a quick view of all this beautiful work. Okay. Turn the video back on. Okay, thank you, Victor. Says super amazing. Love your work. Thank you so much. You guys have any questions for Lori? Get them in the comments. And if you're seeing this after the live stream, feel free to continue to ask questions and I will get them in. Thank you, Carolyn, sorry. Let's see, I think I just had a few kind of closing questions. I wanted to ask a little bit about the color palette for the work. Sorry, the sun is coming into the gallery space in a really interesting way. The color palette for the work is very, almost like these muted blues and tans, and it's really soft. Can you kind of talk about that decision?
Yeah, I mean, certainly a lot of the color, stems from those things in the landscape, a lot of sort of soft browns and yellows. So there's sort of kind of muted earth colors, and then a mix of blues that sort of enter the space to kind of allude to this idea of water. So I think there was some thought to the, keeping that color palette consistent, and in some ways certainly drawing from the landscape. But I do think, yeah, there's a way that, some of them I left black and white, some of them are sort of muted. The original Eroding Shoreline landscape, that one I deliberately sort of painted most of the things sort of white or pale, except for the foliage that's sort of a brighter green to kind of play off the man-made architectural elements being kind of muted or white, and then the foliage itself being green. So there's a really kind of soft, even though it's not wintertime, it almost has a soft kind of snowy attributes to it. So that sort of set the tone. And then when I made the collage pieces, part of it was just the colors that translated from the model, which was kind of interesting. Those browns that again were sort of painted over with white. And then I really started to throw some blues in there because I wanted people to think about water, even if it wasn't in all of the photographs. Yeah, no, I definitely think that you can tell like the lake or the river, and you're looking at Lake Erie or around the surrounding areas, but anyone that lives near water or on the water, I think has that sort of same experience. How do you think that, because you're kind of recording this erosion, do you have any thoughts on like the actual like environmentalism behind it, or what could happen? Yeah, I think the environment and this idea of sort of being good stewards of our ecosystem really is throughout a lot of my work. And a lot of it is just documenting some of the changes, because I really think like when I started to look back at the Lake Erie ecosystem was around 2018, where like the lake freezes and thaws, but the cycles were just really kind of messed up that year. Like the lake did freeze, but then it thawed early, and all of these like gizzard shad sort of fish washed up in maybe February. And so you just start to notice, if I've lived along the lake for 20 years. And I also grew up on Lake Michigan, was sort of the area in where I was born. And you just start to see that things are happening like more intensely, faster, or they're shifting. And a lot of it is trying to document that and think about what are maybe some alternate futures. So when I look at maybe the eroding shoreline, which is happening because there's not particularly good management of that shoreline where I'm living. And then I look at the stuff from Euclid Creek, which is a more managed project, and see how that's thriving. I feel in some ways the work presents these sort of multiple futures or multiple ways to think about how we can interact with that environment. And whether that comes through or not, I don't know. And part of that is then maybe thinking about how you can use the work to encourage sort of thoughtful stewardship of the landscape.
No, I definitely think that comes through. And I like the kind of juxtaposition between the lake and the creek, and because like the water is different, it's moving differently. So yeah, that's super interesting. Well, okay. Lori, thank you so much for leading us on this virtual tour of your work, Shifting Grounds. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you for your comments. Once again, there is still time to see the work in person. And also Danielle Dixon's work that's showing alongside. It'll be on view until Saturday, August 27th. And our gallery hours, once again, are Wednesday through Saturday from 11 to 4. So we hope to see you all soon. And please check out our other videos. And yeah, we'll see you then. Okay, thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.